Africa is the second largest continent in the world. It has 54 countries. The Nile River in Africa is the longest river in the world. The Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramids of Giza is the largest of all the Egyptian pyramids. It is one of the seven wonders in the world. The Great Pyramids were built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu. The Sphinx were a great mythology creature with a body of a lion and the head of a person. The ancient Egypt, a lot of the time had in ancient Egypt, a lot of the times had that satisfied.
A scythe is a mythological creature with a body of a lion and the head of a person. In ancient Egypt, a lot of times the head was that of a pharaoh or god. The great Sphinx faces the sunrise and guards the pyramids of Giza. Timbuktu. Timbuktu is located in the country of Mali and was an important trading spot on the trans-Saharan caravan route. Timbuktu at one point was the center of Islamic culture. It was the center of scholarly study in the Islamic world. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. It has 54 countries on it. The Nile River in Africa is the longest river in the world. The triangular trade route transported between 10 and 12 million enslaved Africans at the Atlantic Ocean, 16th and 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade. Number one, the Atlantic slave trade started a lot earlier than you think. Started in the 1480s. Africans were brought to the country of Portugal. 2. It wasn't initially a transatlantic slave. In early days, enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal or Atlantic islands. 3. The island was not a significant destination for slave ships. In fact, 5% of Africans of transatlantic slavery were loaded on the coast of the present-day U.S. 4. The triangular trade wasn't always triangular. 5. The Atlantic slave trade lasted longer than you imagine. British abolished in 1807, but it continued in other parts until 1860.
April landing. December 6, 1606, May 13, 1607. 104 Englishmen and boys beginning the journey to North America on 3 ships. The Susan, Constance, the Godspeed, the Discovery settled Jamestown, Virginia, naming it after King James I, 1619. With an estimated 700 people in population, the first slaves of Anglo descent, originally captured by the Portuguese, arrived on the White Lion at Point Comfort. Those first slaves are believed to have been stolen by government-hired English pirates from the Portuguese vessel which had headed to Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico.
The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was a state of the Atlantic slave trade in which millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to Americas as part of the triangular slave trade. Treatment of enslaved people and resistant treatment of the enslaved was horrific because the captured African men and women who were considered less than human, they were treated as cargo. Okay, well, I'll just go. Glory Island, French House of Slaves, built by an Afro-French Smithies family about 1780s and 1784. The House of Slaves is one of the oldest houses on the island. It is now used as a tourist destination to show the horrors of slave trade throughout the Atlantic world. Located off the coast of Senegal, used from 15th to 19th century, longest slave trade center. Joseph Sinkay. Joseph Sinkay, born President Day, Sierra Leone, rice farmer trader, captured/kidnapped a slave mutiny on the Cuban amidst the ship 1839. He led to a celebrated trial in the U.S. courts, which led that slaves escaping from illegal bondage to be treated as free men.
1803, April landing at Dunbar Creek on St. Simon's Island, Glen Country, Georgia is the historic site of the mass suicide of 75 Igbo slaves. Nearly 1.5 million Igbo slaves, who are believed to have been descendants of South Igbo tribes, were sent across the Atlantic Ocean during the time of Middle Passage, May 1803, the Igbo and other West African captives arrived in Savannah, Georgia, aboard a ship called the Warrior. They were sold for an average of $100 to John Cooper and Thomas Baldwin, only to be resold to local plantations on St. Simon's Island. During transport aboard the York, the 75 chained slaves took over the ship and drowned their captors, causing the ship to ground in Dunbar Creek. It is believed that after the ship ran aground, the Igbo marched upshore, led by their chief singing as they walked into the marshy waters of Dunbar Creek to drown themselves. A white overseas Roswell King from the nearby Pierce Butler plantation wrote of the event, first band Roswell and a captive Patterson recovered all but the 75 Igbo slaves that drowned. Slaves lived in small shacks with a dirt floor with little to no furniture. They only got 2 meals a day. They worked for 10 hours or more a day for 6 days a week and got off Sunday. They got paid 80 cents a day, which equaled $4.80 a week. Most slaves grew up with absent parents. Many of them shared rooms with relatives and other unknowns to them. Slave marriages and family ties were not recognized by law. Most slaves lived by their spouse until death, but 10 to 20% of slave marriages were broken up by slave sales.
The abolitionist movement was organized in an effort to end the practice of slavery in the United States, and abolishment of the same expression was sought to abolish slavery in the 19th century. Opposed to slavery was a new concept of abolitive society. Dennis Scott was born into slavery around 1799 in Southampton County, Virginia. In April 1846, Brett and Maria filed separate lawsuits for freedom in St. Louis Circuit Court against Emerson, based on 2 Missouri salutes. One salute allowed one person of any color to sue for wrongful enslavement. The state that any person taken to a free territory automatically became free and could not enslave upon returning to the slave state. When they went to trial on June 30th, 1847, however, the judge ruled against them on a technicality and the judge granted a retrial. The Scots went to trial again in January 1850 and won their freedom. In December 1854, Scott appealed his case in the United States Supreme Court. The trial began on February 11th, 1856. By this time, the case had granted notary, and the Scott received support from many abolitionists, including powerful politicians, high-profile attorneys, but on March 6, 1857, the infamous Dred Scott decision, Scott lost his fight for freedom again. The Underground Railroad wasn't underground nor a railroad. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it harder for enslaved slaves to escape. People used train themes, code words on the Underground Railroad.
Civil War, April 1861, April 9th, 1865. The Civil War began on April 12th, 1861, and ended on April 9th, 1865. The main cause of the Civil War was the status of slavery. During the Civil War, the Union Army was the Northern Army led by Abraham Lincoln. The Confederate Army was the Southern Army. The Civil War began on April 1861. In the end of the Union Army triumphed over the Confederate Army. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. This was the beginning of African American freedom.
Juneteenth is short for June 19th. Celebrate Juneteenth and continuing to work in solidarity for racial equality and equity. Thank you.
Segregation means the action of setting someone or someone apart from other people or things or being set apart. The first steps toward official segregation came in the form of quote-unquote black codes. These were laws passed throughout the South starting around 1865 that dictated most aspects of black people's lives, including where they would work and live segregation. And schools remained almost completely segregated until 1968 after congressional passage of civil rights legislation. 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and slaves who had been emancipated after the American Civil War, including them under the umbrella phrase, quote unquote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States. In all, the amendment comprises 5 sections, 4 of which began in 1866 as separated proposals that started in legislative process and were later combined along with a 5th enforcement section into a single amendment. Jim Crow laws. Laws forbade African Americans from living in white neighborhoods. Segregation was enforced for public schools, public pools, phone booths, hospitals, asylums, jails, and residential homes for the elderly and handicapped. Some states required separate textbooks for black and white students. Police versus Ferguson was a landmark 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separated but equal doctrine. The case stems from an 1892 incident in which an African American train passenger, Homer Plessy, refused to stay in a car for black people. Ferguson ruled that separated but equal facilities were constitutional. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision upheld the principle of racial segregation over the next half-century. The ruling provided legal justification for segregation on trains and buses and in public facilities such as hotels, theaters, and schools.
The triangular trade route. They transported between 10 to 12 million enslaved Africans. The Middle Passage was part of this journey and took place in the Atlantic Ocean between the 16th and 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade started a lot earlier than you think. It started in the 1480s. Africans were brought to the country of Portugal. It wasn't initially a transatlantic trade. In early days, enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal or Atlantic islands. The USA was not a significant destination for slave ships. In fact, 5% of the Africans in transatlantic slavery were loaded on the coast of the present-day U.S. The triangular trade wasn't always triangular. The Atlantic slave trade lasted longer than you imagine. British abolished it in 1807, but it continued into other parts to the 1850s.
The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the stage of the Atlantic slave trade in which millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas as part of the triangular slave trade. Treatment of the enslaved people and resistance to treat them of the enslaved was horrific because the captured African men and women were considered less than human. They were treated as cargo. Many were abused, shackled, and suffered malnutrition or died during this journey.
Goree Island, Friendship House slave, built by an Afro-French Metis family about 17 through 1784. The House of Slaves is one of the oldest houses on the island. It is now used as a tourist destination to show the horrors of the slave trade throughout the Atlantic world. Located off the coast of the Sunny Gulf, used from 15th to 19th century, longest slave trade center. Many of the millions of enslaved Africans came from this area.
Born present day Sierra Leone, rice farmer trader, captured and kidnapped a slave mutiny on the Cuban Amistad ship 1839. He led to a celebrated trial in U.S. courts, which held that slaves escaping from illegal bondage should be treated as free men.
Brown versus Board of Education. After his daughter, Linda Brown, was denied education multiple times, a father, Oliver Brown, decided to act and filed a lawsuit against the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. After his case, there were 4 others related to his, so the Supreme Court decided to combine them and use the name Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. The legal victory in this case did not transform the country overnight, and much work remains, but striking down segregation in the nation's public schools provided a major motivation for the civil rights movement, making possible advances in integrating housing, public accommodations, and institutions of higher education. The Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956. Rosa Parks was a young African-American woman who fought for what she believed was right. She simply wanted equality. Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 5th, 1955, to a Caucasian man. Rosa refused to give up her seat because she did not believe that it was fair to give up her seat to a Caucasian man when she was there first. The Supreme Court ultimately ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system. African Americans were required to be seated in the back half of the back of the bus. They did not demand changes to the segregation laws. Rather, the group demanded courtesy, the hiring of African American drivers, and first come, first served seating. On June 5th, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled the law requiring racially segregated seating on the buses violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. December 20th, 1956, they held the decision, and on December 21st, 1956, buses were integrated and the boycott ended. Even though the buses were integrated, there was still violence. The march on Washington, D.C. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the march on Washington on August 28, 1963. After the march, people slowly started to view and do things differently. Currently, some people do not want equality for all, but many people do. This was the last protest for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. In June of 1963, when J.F. Kennedy requested a comprehensive civil rights bill due to the resistance of desegregation and the murder of Medgar Evers. In 1964, Congress passed Public Law 88 to 352. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on basis of race, color, religion, sex, or nation origin. It is the nation's benchmark civil rights legislation. The Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was founded in October 1966 in Oakland, California. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale met at Merritt College in Oakland. It was a revolutionary organization with an ideology of black nationalism, socialism, and armed self-defense, particularly against police brutality. Free Huey became an infectious rallying cry following Huey P. Newton's arrest in 1967. In 1967, Newton was charged in a fatal shooting of a 23-year-old police officer, John Frey, during a traffic stop. After the shooting, Newton was hospitalized with critical injuries while handcuffed to a gurney in a room that was heavily guarded by cops. As a result of his hospitalization and arrest, Eldridge Cleaver took leadership of the Panthers and demanded that Huey must be set free. The phrase was originally shortened to Free Huey, 2 words with which galvanized the movement demanding for Huey's release. The party had enemies in high places, including former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who launched COINTELPRO. Former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover feared the rise of the Black Panther Party, so he created COINTELPRO, a secret operation to discredit black nationalist groups. The counterintelligence nationalist activities. The counterintelligence program's purpose was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize black nationalist activities. We were followed every day. We were harassed. Our phones were tapped. Our families were harassed. Former Black Panther member Erica Huggins, whose parents were visited by the FBI, said in the film. Hoover regularly sent police officers letters encouraging them to come up with new ways to cripple the Black Panther Party through COINTELPRO, though cripple the Black Panther Party. Though COINTELPRO didn't make the party their only targets, 245 out of 290 of their actions were directed at the Black Panthers. 1966 to 1980, the 10-point plan. The Black Panthers established a unified platform, and their goals for the party were outlined in a 10-point plan that included demands for freedom, land, housing, employment, and education, among other important objectives.